Okay, so the park that never was. If you know your acres, you think 467 acres is a lot. And we're going to see exactly how Stoke Newington could have looked very, very different if this scheme to create a massive, grand park in the area actually came to fruition. The view today that we know, you've got Finsbury Park, you've got Clissold, Abney, and the reservoirs. As we're going to see, it could have looked very, very different. It's going to be the story of the creation of Finsbury Park through the lens of Stoke Newington and Clissold Park. The story of how Clissold Park was created is remarkable in itself. I gave a talk, it's on YouTube. There's a whole site I created for the archive of the campaign to save Clissold Park. So if you're interested in that story, you can go and have a look. But today we're going to talk about a 28-year journey to end up with Finsbury Park. And we're going to see that it could have looked very, very different. We're going to see that it was a long journey to campaign for a park for the slum dwellers of Clerkenwell, Hoxton, Shoreditch, St. Luke's, and they ended up with Finsbury Park in the end. But the remarkable thing is we're going to see that throughout this whole evolution and all these schemes and all these plans about where to put that park, through most of them, it actually included Clissold Park. So the park that we know today could have been huge, and not just Clissold Park, but actually something that covered all of Highbury, going all the way to St. Paul's Road, all the way to Seven Sisters Road. Would have been massive. And we're going to see that size got reduced, cost obviously increased for various reasons along the way. So what was the story behind Finsbury Park as we know it today, and how come Clissold Park almost became part of it? And I'm sure that some of you might actually ask yourself, why is it called Finsbury Park? You got Finsbury Square, and the old borough of Finsbury was way kind of Clerkenwell, Farringdon area. What's the story? Well, this was all about providing a green open space for the inhabitants of the former parliamentary borough of Finsbury. So the borough of Finsbury was a constituency, okay, in the 19th century. And you can see that this was the area that is covered. So all the way from sort of Fleet Street all the way to the reservoirs. So it was huge. And you had all these very kind of, I would say, overcrowded, built up areas, all these small parishes there. And then you had Islington and you had Stoke Newington. And there was a big outcry about the state of all the slum dwellers. And there was a campaign to provide them with a green open space, which I think today we can all appreciate because that's where you go when it's hot and you're looking for a nice tree and a nice shade. Not to be confused with the Metropolitan Borough of Finsbury, which was created when the Metropolitan Borough of Stoke Newington was created. And you can see Stoke Newington there, Islington, and the old Borough of Finsbury. There's still Finsbury Town Hall on Rosebery Avenue, and you can still see lovely old street signs with Borough of Finsbury. So that's the one that came afterwards, nothing to do with the parliamentary Borough of Finsbury that we're going to talk about. But you can see roughly how those metropolitan boroughs map to the constituency. So Stoke Newington, Islington, Holborn, Finsbury, and Shoreditch. Those were the original London boroughs. Now, when you look at that map, it's very, very clear that obviously it's a very large area. But if you look at the difference between kind of the southern area, which was very overcrowded, a lot of slums, courtyard, alleyways, people living in terrible conditions. But the northern end, it was countryside. You had the village of Stoke Newington with all the pizza places and the cafes and estate agents and all the meadows and the New River and the Hackney Brook, but this was one area. So there was a big disparity, but you start thinking, okay, if we want to give these people an open space, where do you put it? Now, if you look at kind of where it all began, so it actually started in 1841, where there was a petition to the Queen, because that's when there was also the successful petition to get Victoria Park as the royal park for East London. So people thought, oh, hold on, we also want one. Let's have one for North London, for the slum dwellers of Clerkenwell, Hoxton, Finsbury area. And they started this whole process. And initially, they were actually looking at 4 potential sites. Now, those names may not mean that much to you, but if you look at them in the context of the map of the constituency, you can see that they were really looking to have something quite nearby. Something that was close enough, walking distance for those poor people that can just go maybe on a Saturday or a Sunday, just to relax, just to look for a bit of green space. Those were those original spots. If you wonder where do they map to today, that's more or less where they would have been. So that's kind of Islington Green. You've got there Shepherd and Shepherdess Fields. You can also make now the name of the street there. And then you got by Coldrop's Yard another area. So those potentially could have been green spaces, that kind of royal park for the poor. Now, when you think about who were the people that were driving this campaign, those were not the slum dwellers. They were not the very poor working class people that were too busy trying to survive and live in terrible conditions, but you actually had the local MPs, for example, for Finsbury, that were pushing and agitating to get that open space, along with other individuals that are listed in the story of how this park came to be. But usually looking at people that were motivated by social justice, some of them were Quakers, so they had a lot of convictions about providing that sort of space for the working class. This was not an isolated event, the creation of Finsbury Park and also Clissold Park. There was a big movement in Victorian kind of London to save these open spaces. People were seeing all these old meadows and fields being covered by roads and all these terraced houses, and they started getting very worried because they're losing all this open space. So you had all these people that in different points in time were campaigning to preserve that open space as a public space so people can use it and enjoy it. Our local story, my two favorite heroes, Joseph Beck and John Runt, that gave us Clissold Park. They campaigned tirelessly for 2 years to save that space from development, and they were also part of that movement, if you like. And that actually happened 20 years after Finsbury Park opened. This is just a list that kind of shows you all the open spaces that were saved and created during that period of the 1860s all the way to the 1880s. Some of them common land, some of them kind of proper parks, but there were quite a few. But this was a very focused effort to save those open spaces before the builders would come in. Now, as I mentioned, there was a memorial. There were quite a few. In 1850, there was another one on behalf of the borough's 300,000 souls. And they always refer to it as the lung for the poor people. This was the place where, with all the pollution, if you're living in those conditions, this is the only place where you can go and relax and have a bit of break from all those very difficult conditions and housing and everything else around it. But it wasn't really going anywhere. There was a lot of discussions and debates because they actually wanted this to be a royal park, which meant the government would have to pay for it, okay, which is not that easy. Now, we're going to go through some of the schemes and we're going to see how they evolved and how Clissold Park was originally part of that. So when they thought, okay, let's get a park, the very first scheme, the very first vision was this grand Albert Park. So you had Victoria Park, let's have Albert Park. Makes sense, right? The person who was in charge of looking into it was Sir James Penthorne, and he was the official architect for the Commissioners of Woods and Forests. That was the government authority that was responsible for royal parks. So he was starting to kind of look at potential plans for it. But keep in mind, this was meant to be a grand royal park. And there was a public meeting, and then he was instructed to come up with a plan, and that was the 467-acre royal park that we're going to see in a minute. Now, in terms of the locations, this is when he also focused on Highbury, because those original locations that were, those four ones I showed you earlier, they were gone by this point. They were built over, and it was a race against time because all those open spaces, as the city was expanding, they were gone within months. So that green space that you were hoping is going to be used for the people of Clerkenwell and Farringdon and all that, it was being pushed away by the minute. The scheme was meant to be 467 acres, and the gross sort of cost £430,000, which may not sound a lot to you, but just to put it in context, it's not about inflation, it's not about how much is it in today's money. If you think about Victorian money in context, the entire project to modernize London's sewer system, all of it across London, digging, everything, was 2.5 million. This was 17% of the cost. For one park, for the poor people of Finsbury, 17% of the cost of this entire infrastructure project. And that's kind of where we start the journey. Now, if you think about where Highbury is, again, you see those were the original locations. It starts getting pushed kind of upwards, further away from where they initially wanted to have it. If you think about the size, 467 acres, to put that in context, Hyde Park is 350. Clissold is 54. Right? So just to kind of give you a sense of size. Now, this is the plan for the park. There it is. This was meant to be Albert Park. You can see the reservoirs at the top, and at the very bottom, that's almost basically kind of Highbury corner, St. Paul's Road. So it goes all the way. This is just a close-up. You can start seeing some of the features. A third of the land was meant to be sold for building to actually pay for the scheme. So it was 2/3 parkland, and the rest were meant to be houses, and selling that land to the builders would pay for the park. That was the financial model that they had. Now, just to give you a sense, the Clissold House is there in relation to that scheme. This is Clissold Park in relation to that scheme, so a small part of it. You can see here it talks about Albert Park and approaches in the parishes of St. Mary Islington, Hornsey, St. Mary Stoke Newington, 1851. I created a nice little visual just to give you a sense of what it might have looked like from above. Imagine just a nice leisurely stroll on Church Street on a Sunday, and you end up spending 2 weeks exploring the park, basically, I think. This is overlaying that in terms of the map and the constituency, kind of seeing where it sits. This is on today's view, so you can see exactly the scale of that, and you can see again why the cost was as it was. Imagine when he sort of came to that committee and said, "Ta-da! What do you think?" It's quite fascinating when you look at the detail. So you can see they wanted, I think, to divert green lanes. So green lanes obviously goes on the left side, it goes in. You can see all the houses on the perimeter. So the parkland is in the middle, the outer perimeter are the houses. So this shows you Lordship Road, and this is where Green Lanes is today. But it's very similar if you think about Finsbury Park and how it's got a road that goes all around it, but no houses. This is the Brownswood Park area as it became known. And you can see that the future site of Finsbury Park was not even included. It was not in the constituency. They did not even think about it. It was a woodland area called Hornsey Wood. It was not even in the plans. This is the southern bit. Very posh. This is the aerial that we know today. If that scheme would have happened, it would have looked like that. And if you're thinking about what was the view if you happened to find yourself in a hot air balloon, so that was the plan for Albert Park. The problem was it was extremely ambitious, it was extremely expensive. The government, for various reasons, wasn't keen. It went into discussions in Parliament. There's a lot of back and forth between the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, about how much it's going to cost, why do we need it. They've got Victoria Park, a lot of things. There's actually a plan in the parliamentary archives that shows what the proposal became in 1853. And you can see that it's starting to get smaller. They're starting to kind of think about more practical solutions. And the original Albert Park scheme was shrinking. This map also shows you you're going to see in a second, kind of the proposed diversion of green lanes. And you can see that the cost was also being reduced. And they were trying to kind of find a balance between the government paying for it, but also maybe the ratepayers themselves, through a loan, through a hike in kind of council tax, different ways to pay for it. You can see it's still called Albert Park. This is now 1853. That's the plan. You can see that it's smaller as far as the southern area, starting to shrink. At the very bottom, they talk about the proposed diversion of green lanes. And this is what it looks like. You can see it crossing through the small pond in the park itself. I've got a close-up in a minute. You can see exactly. This is where green lanes, look at that, just outside Clissold House. Imagine there was a bus stop there. You can just get off at Clissold House. Why not? Why not? But that was the plan. Right, and you can see here that's Church Street, Paradise Row. So the conversation were going on, but at this point, we're going to see that by 1856, the government was washing its hands off it. It was too expensive. They didn't want to be associated with speculative building and various other reasons. By this point, in 1855, there was the Metropolitan Board of Works that was responsible for London's infrastructure, roads, sanitation, public parks, and it became a municipal rather than a royal government-funded scheme. There was a new person now, John Barnett, who was in charge of coming up with a new scheme. So you can see that, what is this park going to be? It kept evolving, it kept changing. This was his plan, and you can see that it was only 306 acre, but still very, very expensive. And you get a sense of the boundaries of that area. This was still the point where Clissold Park was meant to be part of this new park. And interestingly, you can see that in this plan, it actually includes the site that became Finsbury Park, right? You can see the area up there in the corner. That's Hornsey Wood that became Finsbury Park. So they kind of shifted all the acreage, trying to kind of get new space, because again, the builders were moving very, very rapidly, encroaching and encroaching every year onto all these open spaces. This is the view that we know today. This was the proposed plan at this point, with the filter beds as well. Could have been a nice feature. But again, you kind of imagine how different it would have been. I mean, we know Clissold today with green lanes and the reservoirs, but if they found the money, if maybe they thought, let's do it, let's do an online petition, they could have done it. This is, again, just giving you the context. And you can see, I mean, can you imagine telling those poor people in Farringdon, look, we got you a park, but it's a 2-hour walk. Yeah, it's not, you think about the whole point of this was to provide open space for those people, but it kept getting pushed further and further away from them. We're now in 1857, and this was the point that Clissold Park was removed from the plan. Again, it was deemed to be too big, too expensive, and the Metropolitan Board of Works said nothing east of Green Lanes. We'll only consider anything west of Green Lanes, as we're going to see. So this is a plan from 1856, and it was actually, I believe, annotated afterwards once the whole area of Clissold Park was effectively removed. And we're going to see there's an annotation that said that the committee, or one of the committees by the Metropolitan Board of Works, said, we won't consider it. If you want us to get involved, you want us to try and pay for this thing, we'll consider it. But if you look at, there were kind of two plans. There's Plan A, which is the current Finsbury Park, and Plan B, but really they formed the same park, this one united park. For surveying purposes, they had like the two sections, but they were really hoping to get both of them through, but only A made it at the end. You can see this is still John Barnett. This is 1856, again for the borough of Finsbury, proposed park. You can see all the roads, and it's quite interesting to see what, like a roundabout. I mean, what is that? Do we really need a roundabout next to the ponds? Or whatever that was meant to be, I don't know. But again, quite ambitious. You can see some of the roads that exist today. You got Clissold House there, St. Mary's Old Church. And this is what I meant, that they kind of tried to get it through by saying there's actually two plans. One is 120, one is 185. But they really formed one scheme. But that maybe provided some room for kind of flexibility. And at the end, that's what happened. Because the verdict was, the Metropolitan Board of Works will only consider the area that was west of Green Lanes. All this, which is Clissold Park, that's not in. So you can see that there's this annotation. This portion is not included in the recommendation of the committee. So we're now in 1857, and now there's a new plan, which is smaller. This is now the plan by Frederick Maribel's municipal survey, and this is what he's proposing now. So again, you can see that the shrinkage continues, right? So no Clissold, you've got the filter beds, all this area that's now built up, and then the area that became Finsbury Park. And that was really kind of plan A, if you think about the previous one. So this is the view today. If that went ahead, you might think it would have looked like that, but you'd be wrong. You know why? Because maybe if that happened, Clissold would not have happened. It would have looked like this. Everyone's worst nightmare, right? But it could, I mean, look, when Joseph Beck or would have actually campaigned for a park for Stoke Newington, if there was this huge one just on your doorstep, maybe not. And this is really, if you think kind of the end, because by this point, again, there were further deliberations. This is like a 28-year journey. If you think about from 1841, all these deliberations from the parliamentary discussions, abandoning the royal scheme in favor of a municipal one. And between 1868 and 1869, they actually built and landscaped what we now know as Finsbury Park. And it opened in 1869. Okay, so 20 years before Clissold Park, they eventually managed to get their park. I think this is just a view of what the opening probably looked like. Everyone looks so happy in those engravings and drawings. Now, like I said, Finsbury Park opened in 1869. 20 years later, on the 24th of July, which is not far away, right? Clissold Park opened. And that was a different story, but also a very dramatic campaign, a lot of ups and downs. It was going to get derailed about 10 times. So it's a fascinating story if you want to look into it. But as far as the evolution of what we were looking at, this just gives you kind of a sense of the shrinkage of Finsbury Park from that very ambitious royal plan to what we know today, and how Clissold Park was almost part of that mega park. Now, at this point you might think, okay, but hold on. So this was a park for the parliamentary borough of Finsbury, but it ended up being outside the parliamentary borough of Finsbury, because this is actually outside. In 1868, they actually tried to amend the boundaries of that constituency to include their new park. And they said, look, there's a new park just opened down the road. It's called Finsbury Park. Can we just amend our boundaries so it's actually within our constituency? Because guess what? We just spent the last 28 years campaigning for a park that's now 5 hours away from the people that were meant to go there, and it's not even in our boundaries. So they requested for the park to be included in the boundaries, and you know what happened? Nothing. It didn't happen. So that's the story of Finsbury Park and how Clissold Park almost became part of it. So hopefully next time you visit both Clissold and Finsbury Park, you might think, wow, I could have walked in a straight line through all these green areas and all these big trees. Instead, I have to hop on the green lanes, get the bus all the way to Manor House. But at least we got Finsbury eventually, and we got Clissold. And that was it. Thank you very much.